Under the quiet veil of midnight, the persistent hum of the all-night laundromat was the only hint of life in the stillness of Florida. Yet, hidden beneath this ordinary scene, a deeper story was unraveling, cloaked in shadows. Sean Brand Pitt, a man weighed down by the ghosts of his own misfortune, found himself troubled by the same unsettling sight. A young black girl, alone, frequenting the laundromat each night. As Brand pursued this mysterious situation, he was unprepared for the heart-wrenching revelation that would soon come to light. A discovery that would forever change both their lives. What secret was this child carrying? And how would her quiet struggle ignite the healing of a man who believed he was beyond redemption? The small town of Orlando, Florida, tucked quietly beneath the starry sky, was still. Its streets were deserted, save for the occasional stray cat or the whisper of leaves in the cool night breeze. Most of the town's residents were fast asleep, their homes dark and their windows closed tight against the outside world. But for Sean Brand Pitt, the night was just getting started. Sitting in his patrol car at the edge of Brand wrapped his calloused hands around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 53, he wore the years of his life like a heavy coat, familiar but fraying at the seams. His salt and pepper hair, clipped short, framed eyes that once sparkled but now only held a persistent weariness. Even so, his gaze remained sharp as it swept over the quiet town. For the last 5 years, Brand had volunteered for the night shift, a routine his fellow officers happily relinquished. While they returned to homes filled with laughter and warmth, Brand found solace in the darkness, far removed from the life he once had. Lifting the cup to his lips, Brand winced at the bitter taste. As he set it down, his eyes briefly drifted to the small photograph wedged in the dashboard. A woman with kind eyes and a little girl with bright pigtails smiled back at him. Elizabeth and Aura, his wife and daughter. 7 years had passed since that fateful car crash, but the memory was as raw as ever. Brand quickly looked away, focusing instead on the empty streets before him. The night shift had become a refuge, a place where he could retreat from the sun and the painful memories it illuminated. In the quiet of the night, he could pretend that the grief no longer gnawed at his heart. Orlando was a small, unremarkable town, a quiet dot on the map where crime was scarce. Most nights went by uneventfully, just the way Brand preferred it. His duties were simple: patrol the streets, check in on the few businesses that stayed open late, and occasionally remind the local teens to keep their noise down. Nothing ever changed, and that suited him just fine. At 11:30 p.m., the clock on his dashboard flipped over and Brand started his engine, easing the patrol car down the empty street. He passed rows of closed shops, their windows dark and uninviting. The only sign of activity came from the 24-hour diner on the corner and the laundromat just a few blocks away. As Brand approached the laundromat, something unusual caught his attention. A small figure, barely discernible in the dim light spilling from the laundromat's windows, moved toward the entrance. Brand slowed down, squinting for a better look. It was a young girl, no older than 8 or 9. Her dark braids were neatly tied back, and she wore an oversized blue jacket that looked worn from use. In her arms, she carried a small stuffed bag of laundry. Brand's brow furrowed, his instincts as a cop sharpening. What was a child doing out this late, alone, and at a laundromat? He watched as the girl slipped through the door, the glass swinging shut behind her. For a brief moment, Brand considered stepping inside to check on her, but he quickly dismissed the thought. Surely she must be there with a parent, he reasoned. Maybe they were just running late with the laundry. It wasn't his place to interfere in every small situation he encountered. Yet, as he drove away, a gnawing feeling of unease settled deep in his gut. Something about that little girl, alone in the night, stirred up memories Brand had buried long ago. He pushed the thoughts aside, focusing on the empty streets ahead. What Brand didn't know was that this seemingly trivial moment would mark the start of a mystery that would alter the course of his life. Over the next few nights, Brand's routine remained unchanged, but something else didn't. Each time he passed by the laundromat, there she was. The same little girl, always alone, always around the same hour, and always with that small bag of clothes. She'd come from around the corner of the building, making it hard for Brand to see exactly where she originated. Initially, Brand tried to brush it off. Maybe her parents worked night shifts, and this was the only time they could do laundry. Perhaps she just enjoyed helping out. But as the days rolled by, and no adult ever appeared with her, his curiosity started to build. He found himself adjusting his patrol, intentionally passing the laundromat more often. The girl's routine remained consistent. She'd arrive just before midnight, slip into the laundromat, and spend hours there. Brand occasionally caught glimpses of her through the windows, meticulously sorting clothes, waiting by the machines, and folding everything with a focused precision. By the fifth night, Brand could no longer ignore the nagging sense that something was off. He pulled his patrol car to the curb across from the laundromat and watched as the girl made her way inside. This time, he noticed things he had previously overlooked. The way her clothes hung awkwardly on her petite frame, the deliberate way she moved, as though she was trying to avoid being noticed, the quick, furtive glances she threw over her shoulder before stepping through the door. A tightness gripped Brand's chest. This wasn't just a kid doing laundry for her family. This was something else entirely. But what? As Brand sat there, lost in thought, he became aware of two women walking past his car, their voices low, but carrying enough for him to hear snippets of their conversation. "That little girl. There she is again every night," one of them whispered. "It's not right. A child out this late. Someone ought to do something. Call social services or—" Their voices faded as they continued down the street, but their words echoed in Brand's mind. So it wasn't just him who had noticed. The town was starting to talk. People were getting concerned. And with good reason, he thought. A child being out at such an hour was troubling in any circumstance. But something held Brand back from immediately acting. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter and how rash decisions could sometimes make situations worse. Or maybe it was the quiet determination he saw in that girl, the way she carried herself like someone far older than her years. Whatever it was, Brand knew he couldn't just storm in and start asking questions. He had to tread carefully to understand the full picture before making any moves. Still, he couldn't ignore this any longer. Something was happening with that child, and as the Sean, it was his responsibility to find out what. As he restarted his car and pulled away from the curb, Brand made a decision. He would keep an even closer watch, gather as much information as possible, and figure out the best course of action. He owed it to the girl, and to his own conscience, to handle this situation the right way. Little did Brand know that his decision to dig deeper would set him on a path that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his town and even about himself. The next evening, Brand's patrol car came to a stop in front of the laundromat once again. He had timed his arrival perfectly, just in time for the girl's usual appearance. Sure enough, as he parked, he saw her small figure rounding the corner. Brand observed her quietly as she slipped inside, then took a deep breath. He had spent the entire day thinking about how to approach the situation, and he had finally decided that the direct approach was the best. He was the Sean, after all. His duty was to ensure the safety of the people in his town, especially children. Stepping out of his car, Brand straightened his uniform and adjusted his hat. He wanted to look professional, but not intimidating. The last thing he wanted was to frighten her. As he neared the laundromat's entrance, he peered through the large front windows and saw her already busy loading clothes into one of the washing machines. The soft chime of the doorbell echoed as Brand stepped inside. The laundromat was nearly deserted, except for an older man napping in a chair in the far corner, and a little girl who briefly glanced up before returning to her task. Up close, Brand could see the frayed edges of her jacket, the worn soles of her shoes. She seemed even smaller than he had first thought, moving carefully as she measured out detergent. "Hey there," Brand said softly, trying not to startle her. The girl froze for a second, then slowly turned to face him. Her large, dark eyes met his for a moment before darting away. She didn't say anything, just stood there clutching a T-shirt in her small hands. Brand crouched down, bringing himself to her level. "I'm Sean Pitt," he said, tapping the badge on his chest. "What's your name?" Her eyes flicked to his badge and back to his face. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she took a small step back, placing the washing machine between them. Brand's heart ached at the sight of her fear. Just as he was about to speak again, the bell above the door jingled. Both Brand and the girl looked up to see a black woman enter, balancing a basket of laundry on her hip. She called out a greeting as she walked toward an empty machine. The girl, Kesha, gave a shy wave and whispered a quiet hi in return. Brand stood, feeling a wave of relief. This had to be Kesha's mother, he thought. Surely this was all a simple misunderstanding. The woman nodded at Brand politely as she passed and began loading her laundry. Brand watched as Kesha quickly moved away from him, heading toward another machine in the corner, keeping her head down and eyes focused on the spinning drum. Brand hesitated. Something still didn't feel right, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe Kesha was just shy around strangers. Maybe her mum trusted her to handle the laundry on her own sometimes. It wasn't the best situation, but it didn't seem like a reason to be alarmed. Still, as Brand gave one last glance around the laundromat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Kesha was now sitting on a bench, her legs swinging as she watched the machine spin. The woman was engrossed in a magazine she'd pulled from her purse. With a sigh, Brand walked out into the crisp night air, a lingering sense of unease settling over him. He had no real evidence that anything was wrong, just a gut feeling that he couldn't ignore. As he climbed into his patrol car, his eyes caught the photo on his dashboard, his daughter Emily, smiling brightly. For a moment, Kesha's face replaced Emily's, and the thought tightened his chest. Both little girls, both vulnerable in their own ways. Brand started the engine, his mind racing. He had hoped this visit would ease his concerns, but instead he was left with more questions. As he pulled away from the curb, he made a mental note to keep an eye on the laundromat. Something about this didn't feel right. The patrol car's headlights cut through the darkness as Brand drove, his mind spinning with conflicting thoughts. He had wanted answers, but all he'd gotten were more doubts. Glancing in his rearview mirror, the laundromat sign grew smaller behind him. Was he being paranoid, or had he missed something important? His hands tightened on the steering wheel. What if Kesha really was in danger? He'd just walked away without doing enough. The thought churned his Brandak. Brand pulled over, his breaths coming quicker. He had been too eager to dismiss his instincts, to believe everything was fine. But what if it wasn't? What if Kesha needed help, and he had failed her? Closing his eyes, Brand tried to steady his breath. He replayed the scene in his mind, the way Kesha had recoiled, the woman's detached greeting. Had there been any real warmth, any indication that she was responsible for the girl? The more he thought about it, the more uncertain he became. Opening his eyes, Brand stared at the empty road ahead. He couldn't just let it go. He needed to be sure Kesha was safe. If he was wrong, at least he'd have peace of mind. But if he was right, and Kesha was in danger, he couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. Putting the car back in gear, Brand headed toward the police station. It was time to start investigating. The next morning, Brand sat at his desk, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. He'd spent the night combing through records, trying to find any trace of Kesha in the local system, but there was nothing. No address, no school enrollment, almost as if the girl didn't exist. Frustration gnawed at him. How could a child be so off the radar in a town like Bridgeton, where everyone knew everyone? Refusing to give up, Brand decided to take another route. If the records held no answers, maybe the townspeople would. He spent the following days talking to locals, particularly those near the laundromat. Despite his best efforts, Brand couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Brand received a range of responses when he asked around. Some folks had seen Kesha and were worried, remarking on how unusual it was for a child so young to be out late at night. Others hadn't paid much attention, assuming she was there with family. Yet no one could tell him who she was or where she came from. One conversation in particular lingered in his mind. It was with Mrs. Johnson, the elderly woman who lived above the laundromat. She'd been there late one night doing her laundry when she spotted Kesha. That poor girl looked exhausted, Mrs. Johnson had said, the lines on her face deepening with concern. I offered her a cookie, but she just shook her head and kept folding her clothes. It's not right, Sean. A kid her age should be asleep in bed, not doing laundry at that hour. Brand couldn't have agreed more. The more days passed, the more his worry for Kesha grew. He found himself driving by the laundromat more often, hoping to spot her and ease his mind. But she remained a mystery. Night after night, like clockwork, Kesha appeared, quietly working through her laundry with surprising efficiency before vanishing into the night. Brand never saw where she came from or where she went, almost as if she existed only within the laundromat's walls. As days turned into weeks, Brand felt a growing sense of duty towards Kesha. There was something about her that struck a chord deep within him. Maybe it was the memory of his own daughter, or perhaps it was his protective instinct. Whatever it was, he knew he couldn't just let this go. The enigma of Kesha became more than just a puzzle to solve. It became a mission, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to something beyond his routine patrols. But with that sense of purpose came a weight of responsibility. If Kesha was truly in danger, every day he hesitated could be another day she was at risk. The thought gnawed at him, haunting him during the nights when sleep came hard. One restless night, Brand found himself parked across from the laundromat again, well past midnight. Kesha had been inside for hours. As he watched her small frame moving among the machines, folding clothes with quiet precision, a lump formed in his throat. The scene stirred something familiar. It reminded him of Saturday mornings, when his daughter Emily used to help his wife with the laundry, her eager little hands trying so hard to be helpful. That memory, once a source of pain, now brought a tender warmth. Watching Kesha through the laundromat window, Brand made up his mind. He couldn't just stand by anymore. He had to understand what was happening with this girl. He owed it to her, to his conscience, and to the memory of his family. Steeling himself, he stepped out of his car and headed for the laundromat. He didn't have a plan, wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he had to try. He had to offer her some help. As he reached for the door handle, he made a quiet promise to himself and to Kesha that he wouldn't stop until he found the truth. Little did he know that truth would change everything for both of them. The familiar chime of the door rang out as Brand entered. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the rows of washers and dryers. Kesha was in her usual spot in the corner, carefully folding a faded T-shirt. Brand approached slowly, trying not to startle her. "Hey, Kesha," he said gently when he was close enough. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide, startled with a flicker of fear. She took a step back, clutching the shirt tightly against her chest like a shield. "It's okay," Brand said, lowering himself to her level. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to make sure you're all right." Kesha didn't say anything, but she didn't run either. She stood there, tense, watching him cautiously, like a frightened animal ready to flee. Brand's heart clenched at the sight. What had this poor girl gone through to make her so guarded? He was about to speak again when something caught his eye, her backpack resting open on the bench behind her. Inside, he glimpsed more than just clothes. He saw a small, worn blanket and a ragged stuffed animal. Before Brand could fully comprehend what was happening, Kesha sprang into action. With a quick motion, she snatched up her backpack, stuffed her neatly folded clothes inside, and darted past Brand toward the exit. By the time he managed to call out, it was already too late. The door had slammed shut behind her, the echo of the chime lingering in the now empty laundromat. Brand rushed outside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit street. He spotted Kesha's small figure disappearing around the corner. Without a second thought, he took off after her, weaving through the quiet streets of Florida. Brand's pulse raced as he pushed himself to keep up. Despite her size, Kesha was remarkably swift, darting between parked cars and cutting through narrow alleyways like a shadow. As they neared the outskirts of town, the old cemetery loomed ahead, its iron gate standing open like a dark, foreboding portal. Kesha slipped effortlessly through a gap in the fence, vanishing into the shadows among the graves. Brand hesitated for only a moment, staring into the darkness that seemed to swallow the cemetery whole. The risk of losing her outweighed his apprehension, and with a deep breath he followed her through the gap. The air inside the cemetery was thick with silence, the dim light from the moon barely piercing through the clouds. "Kesha!" Brand called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. "I just want to help." But there was no answer, only the oppressive quiet of the night. As Brand pushed deeper into the maze of brand stones, his frustration grew. His foot caught on unseen roots, his jacket snagged on low-hanging branches, but none of it slowed him down. How could such a small child disappear so easily? He checked behind every headstone, every shadowed corner, but Kesha was nowhere to be found. It felt as though the night itself had swallowed her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Brand's search came to a disheartening halt. Exhausted, he made his way back to the cemetery's entrance, his mind racing with fear. What if she was hurt? What if someone else found her before he could? Each question weighed heavier on him as he squeezed back through the gap in the fence, feeling the crushing weight of failure settle on his shoulders. He had been so close to helping her, and now she was gone. As Brand trudged back to his patrol car, he made a silent promise. This wasn't the end. He wouldn't give up on finding Kesha, no matter how long it took. With one last look at the cemetery's silhouette against the night sky, he climbed into his car, resolved to try again tomorrow. Little did he know, the truth was closer than he imagined, and what he'd uncover would shatter his heart. The following evening, Brand returned to the laundromat, determined not to let Kesha slip through his fingers again. Hours passed with no sign of her, and his worry mounted with each tick of the clock. Had he scared her away for good? Just as he was beginning to lose hope, a small figure appeared around the corner. His heart jumped. Kesha, with her familiar backpack slung over her shoulder, cautiously approached the door. She slipped inside, and Brand watched as she moved through her usual routine. Though there was a noticeable shift in her demeanor. Her steps were slower, her motions more uncertain. Brand's chest tightened. He longed to reassure her, to tell her everything would be okay. But he knew he had to be careful. He couldn't afford to scare her off again. So he waited, eyes fixed on her through the laundromat's windows, as the hours stretched on and the other patrons slowly trickled out. By the time midnight crept in, Kesha was the last person left in the laundromat. With a steadying breath, Brand finally stepped out of his car and made his way to the door. The soft chime that greeted him seemed louder in the stillness of the night, and Kesha's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes widening in a mix of recognition and fear. She looked like she might run, but before she could move, Brand raised his hands in a calm, reassuring gesture. "It's okay, Kesha," he said gently. "I'm not here to take you away or hurt you. I just want to talk. Is that all right?" Kesha hesitated, her body coiled tight, ready to flee. After what felt like an eternity, she gave the smallest nod. Brand exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath. Slowly, cautiously, he walked over to her. As he got closer, something struck him. Kesha's eyes were swollen and rimmed with red, as though she'd spent the night crying. Kneeling beside her, Brand softened his voice. "Kesha, I'm worried about you. Why are you here, alone? Night after night." Her lip quivered, but she didn't respond. Just as Brand was about to press further, he noticed something. Kesha's eyelids were heavy, her small frame swaying slightly where she stood. She looked utterly drained. Then, right before his eyes, her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the bench. She curled up instinctively, using her backpack as a pillow, her efforts to stay awake completely overwhelmed. Within moments she was sound asleep, her breathing deep and steady. The sight of it hit Brand harder than he'd expected. This wasn't just a young girl doing laundry late at night. This was a child with nowhere else to go, no place to call home. The laundromat had become her refuge, a shelter from the cold, a place to sleep when there was nowhere else. Tears blurred Brand's vision as the gravity of Kesha's reality sunk in. How long had she been living like this? How had he missed it? Watching her sleep, Brand's thoughts drifted to his own daughter, Emily. He remembered how vulnerable she had looked when she slept, how he and Sarah had always made sure to tuck her in, kiss her forehead, and whisper their love before turning out the lights. And now here was Kesha, another child, but instead of the warmth of home, she was curled up on a hard bench in a laundromat. It was too much. The dam broke, and for the first time in years, Sean Brand Pitt allowed himself to cry. Silent tears rolled down his cheeks as he sat on the floor beside the bench, keeping watch over the little girl. In that moment, Brand made a promise. He didn't know how, but he was going to help this child. He would make sure she never spent another night alone in this laundromat. She would have the safety and security that every child deserved. He would do it for Kesha and for the memory of his own family. As the hours passed and the sky began to lighten, Brand remained on the floor, his heart weighed down by the reality of what he had just discovered, yet filled with a new determination. This night would be a turning point, though he didn't know it yet. His life and Kesha's were about to change in ways neither of them could have imagined. The first rays of dawn filtered through the laundromat windows when Kesha began to stir. Brand, having dozed off, blinked himself awake, his body stiff from the hard floor. He watched as Kesha's eyes slowly opened, confusion filling her face as she took in her surroundings. Then her gaze landed on Brand, and her eyes widened in alarm. She sat up quickly, clutching her backpack tightly to her chest. "It's okay, Kesha," Brand said softly, his voice raspy from the long night. "You're safe. I promise. I'm not here to hurt you." Kesha didn't say a word. She just watched him, wary, her body still tense, ready to flee at the slightest hint of danger. Brand remained still, not wanting to frighten her more. He knew it would take time to earn her trust, but he was determined to be there for her, no matter what. Brand took a deep breath, aware that his next words could change everything. "Kesha," he said gently, "I know you're scared, and I understand why. But I want you to know you don't need to be afraid of me. I'm here to help." Kesha's grip on her worn backpack loosened just a bit, though she remained silent. "Can you tell me why you've been sleeping here?" Brand asked, keeping his voice steady and calm. "Where are your parents?" At the mention of her parents, Kesha's lower lip trembled. For a brief moment, Brand feared she might cry, but then, in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear, she finally spoke. "Mum's gone," she whispered. "She got sick, really sick, and she didn't wake up." Brand felt his heart shatter all over again. "Oh, Kesha," he breathed, his voice heavy with sorrow. "I'm so sorry. What about your dad or any other family?" Kesha shook her head slowly. "It was just me and Mom. We came here hoping for a better life, but—" Her voice trailed off, her dark eyes glistening with unshed tears. Brand had to swallow the lump forming in his throat, struggling to hold back his own emotions. The picture was becoming painfully clear. A young girl, alone, navigating unimaginable loss. "I don't know where to go," Kesha added with a small shrug, her voice flat as if she'd long since given up hope. Brand nodded, his mind racing. How had this child been surviving on her own for so long? And how had the world, himself included, failed to notice? "Kesha," he said, leaning forward ever so slightly, "what you've been through. It's more than anyone your age should ever have to face. But I want you to know something. You're not alone anymore. I'm here, and I'm going to help. Will you let me?" Kesha looked up at him for the first time, really looking. Her dark, searching eyes scanned his face, as if trying to decipher whether he was truly sincere. "Why?" she asked after a long pause. "Why would you want to help me?" Brand blinked, caught off guard by the directness of the question. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond, but as he gazed into Kesha's eyes, the answer became clear. "Because," he said softly, "a long time ago, I had a little girl too. Her name was Emily, and if she were ever in trouble, I'd want someone to help her. Just like I want to help you." Something in Kesha's expression shifted. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a flicker of hope, faint but unmistakable. "What's going to happen to me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, full of uncertainty. Brand reached out slowly, giving Kesha time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "First," he said, "we're going to get you some breakfast. Then we'll head to the police station and figure out what we can do to make sure you're safe. How does that sound?" Kesha hesitated, glancing down at the floor before giving a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. Relief washed over Brand like a wave. It was a small step, but an important one. "Okay," he echoed, offering a reassuring smile. "Let's get going." As they stood, Kesha clutching her backpack and Brand leading the way, a cautious sense of hope bloomed within him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be endless questions, bureaucracy, and difficult decisions. But in that moment, he had reached her. He had gained her trust. That was enough for now. The ride to the station was quiet. Kesha sat in the back of Brand's patrol car, holding her backpack tightly to her chest. Brand stole occasional glances at her through the rearview mirror, still trying to wrap his mind around how fate had brought them together. When they pulled into the police station parking lot, Kesha's body tensed. "It's okay," Brand reassured her as he turned off the engine. "We're just going to talk, figure things out. I promise, nothing bad is going to happen." Kesha gave a small nod, though her wide eyes betrayed her anxiety as they walked inside. The station was quiet, the morning shift just beginning. Brand led Kesha to his office and closed the door behind them, offering her some privacy. "Have a seat," Brand said gently, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Kesha perched on the edge, her backpack still clutched protectively. Brand sat down across from her, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. He needed to ask more about her situation, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. "Kesha," he began softly, "can you tell me a little more about what happened to your mum? When did she get sick?" Kesha's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. "It had been years," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. "We came to the States from Haiti. My mum told me things would be better here, but then she started getting sick, coughing all the time. After a while, she couldn't work anymore." Brand listened closely, the weight of her words settling heavily in his chest. "And then what happened?" he asked gently. "We lost our apartment," Kesha whispered, her voice trembling. "We stayed in shelters for a bit, but then Mom got worse. They took her to the hospital, but she never came back." Brand swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump forming in his throat. "I'm so sorry, Kesha. That must have been really tough. What did you do after that?" Kesha shrugged, her thin shoulders rising and falling in resignation. "I didn't know what to do," she admitted, her voice fragile, barely audible. "Mum always warned me that if people found out about us, they might send us back." Fear filled her eyes as she struggled to find the right words. "So, I just stayed out of sight. Found places to sleep where no one would notice. The laundromat was warm at night." Brand listened, his heart aching at the innocence in Kesha's recounting of events that no child should have to endure. Her words were simple, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. The image of her, scared and alone, searching for warmth in a laundromat, stuck painfully in his mind. "You were so brave," Brand said softly, his voice wavering. "But you don't have to go through this alone anymore." Kesha looked up, her dark eyes wide with uncertainty. "Promise?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Brand nodded, feeling the swell of emotion tighten in his chest. "I promise," he said firmly, just as a knock on the door interrupted them. A woman dressed in a sharp suit stepped into the room. "Sean Pitt?" she asked, addressing Brand. "I'm Monica Dawson from Child Protective Services. We received your call about a child needing assistance." Brand rose to greet her, then turned to Kesha. "Kesha, this is Miss Dawson. She's here to help us figure out what to do next. Is it okay if she asks you a few questions?" Kesha hesitated, her eyes shifting between Brand and Miss Dawson, before giving a small nod. As Miss Dawson sat down and began talking to Kesha, Brand couldn't tear his gaze away. He saw Kesha's reluctance at first, the short, quiet answers she gave, but gradually, as the conversation unfolded, Kesha started to open up. She spoke about her life before coming to the States, about her mum's dreams of a better future. Brand felt a pang in his chest as he listened to the love in Kesha's voice when she talked about her mother, and the deep sorrow that surfaced when she spoke of losing her. His heart broke, knowing how much she had lost, and he knew with every passing second that he was becoming more and more invested in her future. As Miss Dawson explained the next steps, a sudden clarity hit Brand like lightning. It was undeniable, something he couldn't ignore. He knew what he had to do. "Miss Dawson," he said, interrupting her gently, "before we continue, there's something I need to discuss with you. In private, if possible." Miss Dawson looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Sean. Kesha, will you be okay for a minute? We'll be right outside." Kesha nodded again, watching curiously as Brand and Miss Dawson stepped into the hallway. Once they were alone, Brand took a deep breath. What he was about to suggest was monumental, life-altering, but he knew it was the right choice. "Miss Dawson," he began, his voice steady, even though his heart raced. "I'd like to apply to become Kesha's foster parent, with the intent to adopt, if that's possible." Miss Dawson's eyes widened in surprise. "Sean Pitt, that's quite the decision. Are you sure about this?" Brand nodded firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything. I can't explain it, but I feel like I'm meant to help this girl, to give her the home she deserves." Miss Dawson studied him for a moment, then smiled warmly. "Well, it's not the usual situation, but I can see how much you care about Kesha. If you're serious, we can begin the process. It won't be easy. There's a lot of paperwork, home visits, but I'll do whatever it takes," Brand said, his voice resolute. "Kesha deserves a chance at a real family, a real childhood. I want to give her that." Miss Dawson nodded. "All right, Sean. Let's talk to Kesha about this, shall we?" As they re-entered the room, Brand felt a surge of nervous excitement. He knelt beside Kesha's chair, looking into her wide, searching eyes. "Kesha," he said gently, "how would you feel about coming to live with me? Not just for a little while, but maybe for good?" Kesha's eyes widened in disbelief. "Really?" she whispered. "You want me?" Tears stung Brand's eyes as he smiled. "Yes, Kesha. I want you to be part of my family, if that's okay with you." For a brief moment, Kesha just looked at him, her expression unreadable. But then, gradually, a genuine smile began to spread across her face, the first real smile Brand had ever seen from her. In that instant, he realized that their lives were about to take a turn they could never have imagined. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Brand threw himself into the process of becoming Kesha's legal guardian with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. There were endless forms, background checks, and home inspections to complete, but Brand never once faltered in his determination. His position as Sean, along with the urgency of Kesha's situation, allowed him to secure temporary custody while the formal process continued. Though the adjustment was tough for both of them, Brand saw glimpses of trust building in Kesha. She was beginning to believe that this new life, this new family, might be something real. During one of the mandatory home visits, Brand met Kesha's caseworker, Sarah Thompson, a kind-hearted woman with a gentle smile. As they sat in the living room, now shared between them, Brand noticed the tension in Kesha's eyes as Sarah attempted to strike up a conversation. "Kesha," Sarah began softly, "can you tell me how things have been going for you recently?" Kesha's gaze flickered to Brand, silently asking for support. He offered her a small, encouraging nod, and she took a deep breath. "It's different now," she replied quietly, her fingers nervously tugging at the edge of her shirt. "A good different, but sometimes it's hard to talk about before." Brand felt a warmth rise in his chest at her words. More than anything, he wanted to gather her up in his arms, to protect her from ever feeling hurt again. But he knew she needed this moment. to speak her truth, to start healing. "You're doing great, Kesha," he said gently, his voice full of reassurance. "I'm right here." Sarah smiled softly, trying to ease Kesha's nerves. "How have things changed since you've been living with Sean Brand?" Kesha's expression lightened just a bit. "I'm not scared all the time anymore," she admitted, "and I have my own bed now. Sean Brand even got me a blanket with butterflies on it." Brand felt a lump rise in his throat at the simple joy she expressed over something as small as a blanket. "That sounds beautiful," Sarah said warmly. "What else do you enjoy about staying with Sean Brand?" Kesha paused to think for a moment before a small smile crept onto her lips. "He makes me pancakes on Saturdays," she said shyly, "and he reads me stories before bed, even when he's tired from work." Brand blinked in surprise. He hadn't realized just how much those small gestures meant to her. He made a mental note to never let their Saturday pancake tradition slip away. "It sounds like you and Sean Brand have created a nice routine," Sarah observed. "How does that make you feel, Kesha?" Kesha's brow furrowed thoughtfully before she answered. "Safe," she said quietly, "and happy. I didn't think I could be happy again after—" Her voice faltered, her eyes growing distant, clouded by memories she wasn't ready to share. Brand reached out, lightly placing his hand over hers. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to talk about anything before you're ready." Sarah nodded in agreement. "That's right, Kesha. We're here for you, and we can focus on the present and the future. Speaking of which, what are you most excited about if you stay with Sean Brand?" Kesha's eyes brightened with excitement. "We're going to paint my room," she said, her voice full of enthusiasm. "Sean Brand said I can choose any color I want. I think I'll pick yellow, like sunshine." As Kesha continued to talk with Sarah about her dreams for the future, Brand felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over him. Watching her slowly open up, hearing her talk about a future filled with hope, it was more than he had ever dared to wish for when he first found her alone in that laundromat. "Kesha," Sarah said as their conversation began to wind down, "you've been incredibly brave, but you know you don't have to face the world alone anymore, right? Sean Pitt is offering you something permanent, a home, a family." Kesha looked up at Brand, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "Really?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "You really want me to stay?" Brand leaned forward, his voice steady and full of love. "Forever." Brand felt the sting of tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. He knelt down in front of Kesha, gently taking her small hands in his. "Yes, Kesha," he said with conviction, "I want you to be part of my family. I know I can't ever replace your mum, and I wouldn't try to. But I promise you this. I will love you, protect you, and give you the home and life you deserve." For a moment, Kesha simply stared at him, her deep brown eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she whispered, "Okay, I'd like that." Brand's heart swelled with emotion. Glancing up, he saw Sarah watching the exchange, her face glowing with a warm smile. "So, what's the next step?" he asked, his voice firm with determination. "How do we make this official?" Sarah's smile grew. "Well, Sean," she began, "there's still paperwork to finalize and a few more home visits to get through. But from what I've seen today, I'd say you're on the right path. Kesha needs stability, love, and understanding, things you seem more than ready to provide." As they discussed the next steps, Brand felt a renewed sense of purpose, one that had eluded him for years. Looking at Kesha, this brave little girl who had already faced so much, He knew deep down that he would do everything in his power to give her the life she deserved. He also knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome. But, seeing the flicker of hope beginning to light up in Kesha's eyes, Brand knew it was all worth it. This was the start of something new for both of them, a chance to heal, grow, and build a family together. And Brand was ready for it. The months that followed were a whirlwind of trials and triumphs. Brand poured himself into the process of becoming Kesha's legal guardian, with a determination that had been dormant for far too long. Paperwork piled up, interviews were scheduled, and home visits became a regular occurrence. Yet, Brand never wavered in his commitment. For Kesha, the transition was slow but steady. As the weeks passed, she began to trust Brand more. The quiet, withdrawn little girl gradually revealed a curious, bright personality. There were hard moments, nights filled with nightmares that left her crying out, or moments of insecurity that made her retreat inward. But Brand stayed by her side, offering comfort and consistency. Slowly, she began to believe in this new reality, that it wasn't temporary, that this home, this life, was hers to keep. One afternoon, as they sat on the front porch of what was now their shared home, Kesha looked up at Brand with serious eyes. "Sean Brand," she said softly. Though she'd been with him for months, she still called him Sean, a habit from their early days together. "Are you sure you want to keep me forever?" Brand felt his heart tighten at the vulnerability in her voice. He knelt beside her, looking her straight in the eye. "Kesha," he said, his voice steady and sure, "I have never been more certain of anything. You are my family now, and that's forever, no matter what." Kesha's eyes welled up with tears, but this time they were tears of joy. She threw her arms around Brand, hugging him tightly. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, the word Dad still new and sweet on her lips. Brand held her close, his own eyes misty. "I love you too, sweetheart. So much." The day of the adoption hearing arrived at last. Standing in the courthouse, Brand gripped Kesha's hand as the judge reviewed their case. This was the moment that would officially make them a family. Brand held his breath as the judge spoke. Having reviewed all evidence and testimonies, the judge said with a gentle smile, "I am pleased to approve this adoption. Congratulations, Sean Pitt and Kesha. You are now, in the eyes of the law, father and daughter." Applause erupted in the courtroom, but all Brand could focus on was Kesha, whom he lifted into a giant hug as both of them laughed and cried at once. It was official. They were a family. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the bright, sunlit day, Brand looked down at his daughter, and saw her beaming, her eyes filled with joy and hope for the future. The journey ahead might still hold its challenges, but in that moment, Brand knew they could face anything together. "So, Kesha Pitt," Brand began with a heart full of affection, "how should we celebrate today?" Kesha paused for a moment, her face breaking into a grin. "Can we go to the laundromat?" she asked. Brand raised an eyebrow, taken aback. "The laundromat? Are you sure?" Kesha nodded firmly. "That's where you found me," she said softly. "It's where our family began. I want to see it again, but this time, let's make it a happy memory." Tears welled up in Brand's eyes, and he nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Hand in hand, they made their way to the laundromat, ready to replace old memories with new ones. The laundromat looked different in the daylight, Brand thought as they stepped inside. The harsh glow of the fluorescent lights was softened by the sun shining through the windows, and the hum of the machines sounded cheerful, no longer lonely. Kesha led him to the bench where he had first seen her, fast asleep all those months ago. They sat down, both quiet for a moment, lost in thought. "You know," Brand said softly, "I used to think of this place as a reminder of sadness. But now it feels like a symbol of hope. It's where our story began." Kesha leaned against him, nodding. "It was scary back then," she admitted, "but now it's special because this is where I met you." Brand wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. As they sat there, he marveled at how much had changed. The quiet, frightened girl he had found was now his daughter. Still shy at times, but growing more confident and happy each day. He caught himself smiling more, laughing at her jokes, and looking forward to tomorrow. One bright morning, as Kesha prepared for school, Brand made a decision he'd been putting off for years. "Kesha," he called over breakfast, "how would you feel about visiting the cemetery with me this weekend? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Kesha looked up, curious. "Who?" Taking a deep breath, Brand said, "My first daughter, Emily, and my wife, Sarah. I think it's time I introduced you to them." Kesha's eyes widened, but she nodded solemnly. "Okay," she whispered. "Can I bring flowers?" That Saturday, they stood together in front of two neatly kept graves. Brand felt the familiar ache in his chest, but this time the warmth of Kesha's hand soothed it. "Sarah, Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is Kesha. She's our daughter now. I think you both would have loved her." Kesha stepped forward, gently placing small bouquets on each grave. "Hi," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't get to meet you, but I'll take good care of Dad. We'll take care of each other." Tears streamed down Brand's cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of sadness. As they walked back to the car, a sense of peace washed over him, a peace he hadn't felt in years. His past and present had finally come together, and for the first time, he felt hopeful about the future. As time went on, they developed their own little traditions. Every Saturday morning, they would go to the laundromat together. It wasn't that they needed to. Brand's house had a perfectly good washer and dryer, but the laundromat had become their special place, a reminder of where their journey began. One Saturday, as they sat on their usual bench, watching the machines spin, Kesha looked up thoughtfully. "Dad?" she said, the word always bringing warmth to Brand's heart. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night?" Brand wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I think about it every day," he confessed. "And every day, I'm grateful that I did. You've brought so much joy into my life, Kesha. I hope you know that." Kesha smiled, snuggling closer. "You saved me," she said simply. Brand shook his head, his voice thick with emotion. "No, sweetheart. We saved each other." As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Brand reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the lonely nights of his past to the bright, joyful days of his present, from the scared little girl he found at the laundromat to the incredible young woman sitting beside him now. Life had taken them both down difficult roads, roads full of loss and heartache. But those roads had also led them to each other. And as Brand sat there with his daughter by his side and a future filled with hope, he knew that every step along that journey had been worth it. In the end, this wasn't just a story about Sean discovering a little girl in a laundromat late at night. It was about two lost souls finding each other, about healing, about hope, and the incredible power of love to transform lives.